let's do this. Let's introduce Mr. Uh, Paul Schwartz. You're co-founder of the Campaign for Lead-Free Water. What is that?
So we're a national community-based environmental justice and organization that's working with people in communities like Robert in Milwaukee, who are trying to figure out, did we have an exposure like in Washington, D.C. and in Flint to lead and water in our taps? And what can we do to mobilize our communities to protect ourselves, both as individuals and in our families and our cities and our states? And what was the right science? What were the effects, especially on the most vulnerable populations? And what were the policies that were the right policies to do to protect our communities, both from individual harm and from community-wide harm that's been visited on us for decades without people knowing? So we were founded in 2016. Robert was part of the first meeting in Washington, D.C., drove down with a friend without knowing us, and we put together really an important, powerful, community-based set of organizations to be in communication with each other and to be in solidarity and to support us in standing up to the okey doke that was being visited on us by our water agencies, by our state and local health agencies, by EPA, and by the Centers for Disease Control. And as Robert said, standing up to the false narratives that the lead exposure in our homes was just from paint, soil, and dust, when we know that lead and water is ubiquitous in almost every building in the United States, and that the lead pipes are really critical to get out in a timely way, and that people, not the government, are going to have to be doing our own education about how to protect ourselves, especially since it's going to take a long time, not only to get the lead pipes out, which Robert has been, and FLAC and GTLO have been advocating to get out in a timely way for many years. But also, even if we got a magic fairy came and waved her wand and all the lead pipes came out, which is really critical and an important step, there's still going to be lead exposure at the tap in almost every home, in our schools, our rec centers, our libraries, our commercial establishments. So the fortunate thing, I just want to just one last point before you take over. The fortunate thing is that we have a technology which are duly certified filters that you can put on the counter or on the tap that can reliably get the exposure down while we're working hard to get out the lead from our homes and from outside our homes in the pipes. So
I have to ask you that many Americans are unaware of this. The majority of the American people are totally unaware of this. And even if they hear about it, they don't believe that our government would do such a thing to them. Your response? Your response, Paul.
Oh, my response. I thought you were turning to Robert.
No. We'll go to Robert after your response to people who couldn't believe that our elected officials or our government would do that to the citizens of this nation. And
yeah, that's a really great point, Earl. And I just want to say that it really is shocking that this manufacture of ignorance by our government and by public health officials has been going on for so long. But 10 years before Flint, here in my hometown in DC, we had 20 to 30 times the amount of lead coming through our taps. And we had peer-reviewed studies that have shown a 37% increase in fetal death across the city of DC, the nation's capital, and somewhere between up to 42,000 of our kids between 0 and 6 that got elevated levels of lead in their blood. And 20 years after that exposure, that was well documented in 2004, Peer-reviewed literature shows that there's about a 20-year lag between those large-scale exposures and increases in aggression, violence, and homicide. And you know that DC's had one of the worst homicide rates in the nation, and that's been coming down now, but not like other big cities. And that's because of when you have massive lead exposure, there's about a 20-year gap. And that's what we had in DC after a 2.5-year cover-up. So the Centers for Disease Control faked a study with our Department of Health that said there was zero relationship between any amount of lead in water and elevated levels of lead in our blood. That was exposed in congressional hearings several years later. And that study that was published in CDC's premier health publication called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report really misled people all over the country. And so governments have been in the hip pocket of the water utilities. The water utilities have used the lead paint and soil and dust exposure, which is significant and important, and something that we need to do a better job of in Milwaukee and DC and in other cities all around the country. And that's been really mishandled all over the country. Has been used as a fig leaf for the water authorities to hide behind. And the reason they're hiding behind it is because they don't want the liability, they don't want the political heat, and they don't want to be told what to do with our resources, our rate dollars and our tax dollars that are being given to them. And now what they want to do is they want to say, well, we'll take our time, but we're not going to protect people today with filter distribution. And for people who don't have the money to do it, with the subsidization to make sure, and the training to make sure that we get the right filters in the right place and that we operate them properly. So that's the short scoop.
So Paul and Robert and others, this is not something that we can do in a sprint. It's going to take some time, and I'm allocating the time on my show from now until whatever time it takes for us to get this story out. However many times we have to have the discussion, we'll do that. So, Robert, we've got to take a short hiatus. Guys, hang on. It is a special edition of the Earl Ingram Show. I'm joined by Mr. Paul Schwartz, Robert Miranda of Flat, and we are talking about lead pipes and lead in the water in the United States of America. All right, welcome back to a very special edition of the Earl Ingram Show. As always, you can join us at 855-752-4842. That's 855-752-4842. My guest, Mr. Paul Schwartz from Washington, D.C., and Robert Miranda, good friend from the city of Milwaukee. Robert, you and I remember you coming to me long time ago, man, talking about lead pipes and the impact it was having on our community, long before any of us really thought about it. How did you come into that information?
Well, in 2014, Milwaukee experienced a record number of water main breaks, and that was hitting the news around that time. It was very impactful because of the number of water main breaks we were suffering. And then the following year, I started seeing uh, a spike in lead blood level increasing in Milwaukee. At around that same time, a whole lot of stuff with Flint was going on. And then so I started putting things together and I started saying, wow, Milwaukee seems to have had its own episode of a lead poisoning episode that people are not aware of. And Flint, which had an episode of lead blood poisoning through the source water change from the Huron Lake to the Flint River. I said, well, Milwaukee just had one because of all these water main breaks. And we did a request of records and found that there was a link with rising lead levels and the water main breaks, a record number of water main breaks. And we also, over the past couple of years, saw that once the water main breaks leveled off, the lead blood level spiking, started leveling off. And so we knew there was a correlation. And so when we began the fight, we experienced a lot of what Paul had just described. The attacks by government on us, the attacks by nonprofits aligned and partnered with the government, going at us for putting out misinformation. As a matter of fact, like I said earlier, at the time, the Barrett administration was involved in a lawsuit against the lead paint industry. And the Barrett administration, as well as the chief of staff at the time, Pat Curley,
the former mayor of a city of Milwaukee,
right,
go ahead,
Tom Barrett, they had a big press conference, and it was covered by all the media, journals, and everybody, accusing us of being aligned with the lead paint industry to put out misinformation to make us look like we were helping the lead paint industry try to win its lawsuit, when in fact we weren't even near anywhere with the lead paint industry. But when we started hitting harder, that's when the administration started coming out harder. Now, the administration was also exposed for covering up when Marquette University held a symposium back in September of 2016, and they invited a renowned expert on the issue, and he was the keynote speaker at Marquette University. And even on his PowerPoint, he put up this big sign in front of the mayor and everybody where he said Milwaukee historically has had a cover up of lead and water for years. We knew that to be true because the city of Milwaukee partially was trying to cover up the issue of lead poisoning our bodies through water because of the lead paint lawsuit that the city had against the lead paint industry. They didn't want to lose that. The lead paint industry says, well, we'll take responsibility, but we're not going to take full responsibility. And they
were poisoning
of our community.
Yeah.
But they couldn't prove anything because the city of Milwaukee, up until 2017, was not testing the water for lead whenever it did its environmental home assessments, and when it started looking at homes that had reported children with high blood lead levels. And so without that data, the lead paint industry couldn't really prove that they had 100% liability here. But when we started coming out showing water was also a major contributor to the lead blood paint levels, lead blood poisoning of our community, that's when we started getting attacked. That's when we started getting assaulted verbally by the administration. And when we started pushing back and we had the lead transparency resolution passed, at the time, Alderman Zielinski and Alderman Donovan and Alderman Ashanti Hamilton helped pass that lead transparency resolution. That's when the bottom fell out on the lead program, and the lead program fell apart. Immediately, a lot of the mayor's administration started abandoning ship. By the time we got to the point where we were back in 2019, that's when the mayor decided it's time to make the hiatus to Luxembourg to go after the Wiener Schwartz.
So I want to thank Greg from Jane Madnair and Madnair on Air. He got a clip from Eric Hovde, who's running for senator. Calvin, do we have enough time to get that in? All right, if you'll be so kind as to play it for us, please.
Look, lead paint was stopped in the 1970s, but there's still homes that have lead paint. Lead pipes are more dangerous. The reality of it is there's not a lot of lead pipes anymore because typically a pipe will erode over a certain amount of time and they replace them. So I think it's trying to act like there's a bigger issue. The amount of lead pipes in this country are very small.
That is crazy.
Well, okay.
That is crazy.
So I'm watching Paul Schwartz in DC and my guest Robert as they listen to a guy who wants to be the senator.
Well, he better not be, because for what he said, that guy is crazy. He has no idea what he's talking about.
Okay, so 855-752-4842. Our guest again, Mr. Paul Schwartz from Washington, D.C., Robert Miranda from Platt, and we're talking about, lead in the water. And, President Joe Biden was here on yesterday in the city of Milwaukee pledging $46 million more to deal with a problem that a guy who's running for United States Senate says is not a big problem at all. You tuned into the Earl Ingram show.
Ready to put America in a vice.
All right, welcome back to a special edition of the Earl Ingram Show. As always, you can join us at 855 752 4842. Very special edition of the Earl Ingram Show. I'm joined by Robert Miranda, a good friend of FLAC, who has been at the forefront of addressing, lead contamination in the pipes, not just in the city of Milwaukee, but many parts of this nation. He has invited Mr. Paul Schwartz. And Paul, you and your title is what?
Yeah, I'm a co-founder of the Campaign for Lead-Free Water and an organizer along with Robert, working with local folks in several states and nationally to take this on and make sure that people in our communities have the tools to protect themselves.
All right, Robert, we'll take a quick call and then we'll get back to you. Let's go to Al from Milwaukee. Good morning to you, Al. You say what? Al.
Everybody listening. Yes, I hear you.
Okay, go ahead. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I want to say to all of the people in Southeast Wisconsin and everyone that can hear this, you all need to congratulate Robert Miranda for all of his work since the 1970s, working on lead abatement. And when we were out there fighting about the creeks flooding and what have you, and our homes flooding, Robert was out there fighting for lead abatement, and he didn't let it go. And all of the things that have happened as a result of his work is what you are experiencing right now with the money coming in and the work that's going to be done. So personally, I want to say thank you, Robert.
Hey, Al, you are 100% correct. Thank you very much for that call. We're going to go to Cindy from Michigan. Thank you very much, Cindy. You say what?
Hey, Earl. I live in a little town called Watervliet, which is just across the lake. I used to live in Milwaukee years ago, loved it, but my parents lived here, so I came back home. I'm about 15 miles, 20 miles away from Benton Harbor, Michigan, and they had a bad lead problem, and they're primarily a black majority town, with 100-year-old infrastructure. So they were within the Biden administration's infrastructure program to get those lead lines all completely redone, including to the homes, from the connection from the street to the homes. And I can attest that in our town, we did the same thing. We had to use a USDA loan back when loan rates were very low, right after the 2008 crash of the economy. The interest rates were very low right then. That's when my town got on the case, said, listen, we've got to take care of this, so we're going to have our water shut off. Also, they had people that came out to the house and inspected inside my house. I had just had my lines all redone within, but they would have been involved in making sure that those loans and stuff were done. And I would ask realtors, people who actually have to sell homes and make those homes attractive for the buyer, how are they going to sell homes and say, yeah, it's all full of lead? They're not going to. So anything that is done to improve that situation is great. And I'm glad that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are on the case, because there's also another thing. Ask educators what the studies are about lead to the child's brain.
Hey, Cindy, I wish we had more time. Thank you for the call. I do want to say that we're going to continue this discussion next Wednesday at the same time. And how many other Wednesdays after that it takes, I'm going to commit to having Paul Schwartz, Robert Miranda, and others on these airways to continue to talk about this, because there's no way possible we can even scratch the surface of the magnitude of what this issue is. Thank you very much, Cindy. Robert, you were saying.
So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the changes that are coming down now with this lead copper rule, the LCR, the Safe Water Act, and I'm sure Paul can give us more of the details of what's going on. They're supposed to release a final version of the changes here real soon. But before I do that, I wanted to make sure that if people are very interested in reading a little bit about the background of the work that we've been doing. We published an article in the Milwaukee Beagle just this week. In the Milwaukee Beagle, people could go there and they could read a lot of what the history and a lot of the information that we're talking about today. They could read that on there as well. But the lead copper rule is the rule that is under the Safe Water Act, and the Safe Water Act was passed to ensure that the cities and municipalities and water utilities provide our communities with safe drinking water. But the lead copper rule was very weak. So in the last few years, there has been a push, national push, and Paul Schwartz and the national campaign has been very instrumental in pushing for a lot of the changes in the lead copper rule. And so a lot of the lead copper rule of the past gave a lot of cover and shelter to governments to basically misinform and mislead and not provide the accurate information that is needed. We're making those changes now to change all that so that we could get the most accurate information so that the public can stop being misled. But I'm going to give Paul the mic so he could go ahead and give us a real good detail and understanding of the changes that are coming. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Earl. First of all, it's really important what Robert said to understand that when the regulations under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act were passed, there was a lot of opposition from the water utility industry, including the association that Milwaukee Waterworks is a part of, called the American Waterworks Association, which is the biggest association of water utilities in the United States. And they're still pushing, even though the rule that Robert talked about, the lead and copper rule, was dropped today. It's 900 pages long. And in those pages, which we're still reading and taking notes and talking to experts on corrosion control and how lead pipes work, and about the public health effects of the details of that rule, there have been in our preliminary breakdown some steps forward, but we're still looking to make sure that a few critical things are really attended to that haven't been dealt with on the up and up. One especially is the public education and messaging that's required both in the rule and that tells water utilities what they have to do in terms of notification and in terms of letting people know about the problem. But also the agency itself, EPA, and we have to confirm whether they made improvements on this, have been publishing on their website lots of information that, if followed, will actually make the lead and water situation worse. And unfortunately, the water utilities and our governments refer to that bad information. It doesn't follow the science. So that's one of the things that I and Robert and our colleagues are going to be checking very carefully as we read through this 900-page rule. The other thing that's happening is that under the lead service line replacement program that Milwaukee Waterworks will be pulling together and implementing in the community, and other water utilities like them across Wisconsin and across the country, there are a lot of off-ramps that we need to make sure have been tightened up so that they can't accelerate the harm. For instance, in Washington, D.C., when we had our agency under the microscope and the media was looking at them, they pledged $300 million they didn't have the day before to accelerate lead pipe removal. But what they did is they only replaced part of the lead pipe. And that increased the exposure of lead to people in such a way that people were 2 to 3 times more likely to get elevated levels of lead in their blood while the pipes were being swapped out because they didn't do it right. So we need to make sure that the rule is going to make sure that all the lead pipes are found and that they're pulled out properly. And that's going to take people like Robert and the listeners here to come together to hold our water utilities accountable and to learn what we need to know to protect ourselves, to make sure we're using filters right now, today, while we're waiting for this to come out. Sorry about that.
So, Paul, no, you're fine. So, Robert, it has to leave. We're going to carry you until the top of the hour. But I want you to know, as I said to Robert, so from this point forward on Wednesdays, at this point in time, people can lock in. We're going to bring you guys on again and again and again because people don't know the magnitude of all the different intricacies that are involved in what we're talking about. And Robert, quickly before you get out of here, people who are listening, children, let's talk about the impact of lead on newborn babies and children, why this is so important.
And Paul could carry on that conversation on the flip side. But again, this is so important because even when babies are born, they should be tested for lead because we don't know how much lead is in the mother's. Yes, we don't know how much lead is in the mother's blood. We don't know if the mother has contracted lead to that fetus while the fetus was growing in the mother. And so babies who are born should be immediately tested for lead to see if there's any lead levels in those babies. Because as the babies grow up and the mother isn't aware that she is lead tainted within her blood, the milk she is, if she's breastfeeding, can contribute more to the blood lead levels of these babies. These are kinds of information that get out there. Some people know this, a lot of people don't. And so we need to get this kind of information out there so that people understand the magnitude. Just because the government says, oh, the lead exposure in the water is down to 1 parts per billion or 2 parts per billion, that is nonsense. It is 0. It's the number we need to be at. And if you're drinking and cooking with water that has 1 or 2 or 3 parts per billion in it, if you're consuming that every day, that accumulates in your blood system, that builds up in your body, and that lead stays in your body and hibernates in your bone and soft tissue. And for women, especially pregnant women who stress, eventually that releases back into the blood system and affects the fetuses. This is a major issue. This is nothing to play with. And we have to make sure that the government is providing the right information so that the public understands what it has to do to protect it.
So, Robert, I will see you again on next Wednesday at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother.
All right. Welcome back to a very special edition of the Earl Ingram Show. As always, you can join us at 855-752-4842. I want to thank my good friend Robert Miranda, for as Al said earlier, for all of the decades of hard work that he has put into this. And as Tony never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has changed the world. So, Tony, kudos to you. Paul, I want to say to you, sir, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you talk about the EPA and you talk about governmental bodies that are there supposedly to protect the American people. And there are people who are listening who would not believe that the governmental bodies that are there to protect us can somehow, be jaded politically. And every day on my show, I try to get people to understand that if they continue to just trust without verifying, and they say, well, it's America, it's our great nation, this wouldn't happen, they're not going to allow this to happen. But it is true. Now, let me get to you with this, because we're going to be meeting again and again and again, so we can't get this all out. What would you say to people who how often they should have their children tested for lead? Because it's not something that's done when they draw blood. You have to make sure you tell the people, the doctor that sends you to have the blood drawn, that you need to have them test. I can't tell the people drawing blood to test for lead. That's something that you talk about educating people, all these different aspects of it. I know I said a lot, sir, but bite off whatever you can chew.
Thanks, Earl. You know, this is on one level a very easy thing to understand, and we've known for 2,000 years since Roman and Greek times that lead and water don't mix, and when they do, they're bad for you. Right. But there's three really simple key things to understand. One is that lead is in the water in near about every building in the United States. Second, that the lead exposures that we get, whether they're small or large, and whether they're acute or chronic, that lead only stays present in the blood for around 30 days. And so if you're not going to get a test within 30 days, even though the lead is still resident in your bones and in your body in the way that Robert talked about, you'll miss that exposure. The second thing is that blood lead testing is important, but right now there's a struggle to get it even done twice a year at 1-year-old and at 2-year-old. It affects every age of person, our young people and the fetuses in the womb the most. And mostly the blood lead testing that's done misses the exposure. That's a lifetime exposure once it happens. And so while it's important to get blood lead testing because it can show if there's been lead in the blood in the last 30 days, and that's really critical, you could have up to a hazardous waste levels of lead exposure, and that could be missed if you don't get it within that period. So I think people should presume that there's some level of lead exposure.
In all of us, maybe.
In all of us. And it gets passed along through the generations as well, as we're growing in the womb. So the second thing is that people talk about lead testing at the tap. And that's important too, but lead testing at the tap doesn't get at the fact that lead comes out erratically and randomly. So if you had a test of 0 or 1 or 15 1 minute, in the next hour or the next day or the next week, you could have a test of 100 or 1,000. And that too misses the impact and the exposure that we have in our community. In DC Water, our water utility's own water authorities, data suggests that they use for compliance with the EPA regulations, suggests that there's lead in 85% of the samples that they take across the city. And that's not really going to be different in any city, even if they have the right chemicals in the water. Even if your lead pipe has been swapped out, that exposure is still going to be there. So the key thing is to protect ourselves. And the technology that we have available to do that now is a duly certified filter with ANSI or NSF standards 42 and 53. And while we're waiting and advocating for the lead to come out in the proper way, people need to protect themselves.
So I want to say first off, Mr. Schwartz, it's been a pleasure to get a chance to meet you. And so we got a lot of great work that we'll be doing now.
Amen.
Wednesdays on the Earl Ingram Show at 8 o'clock. We'll see you next Wednesday, and we'll continue this really critically important information that should be disseminated to all American citizens. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you for
We'll
being a
talk
leader,
next
Earl, and using your broadcast and your bully pulpit to hold the elected officials and the government officials accountable and to arm our people with the information we need for justice and peace. As Marvin Gaye said, what's going on?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.